The vote was 19-3. Nora Halvorsen, 23 years old, stood inside a sod meeting hall in what would soon become North Dakota, holding a piece of paper with a direction written on it and a deadline of sundown. The settlement committee had just decided, formally and in writing, that she could not stay. No husband, no family, no labor to contribute through another Dakota winter. She was a liability they couldn't afford to carry. What they gave her was the worst claim parcel in the territory, a shallow clay gulch, 2 miles northwest, clogged with a cattail marsh nobody wanted, with flat ground and full exposure to the north wind and no timber within a mile. She had $3.17. And here is the thing that makes this story so remarkable. The committee thought they were sending her somewhere to fail, but they were actually sending her to the only piece of ground in the entire settlement that could save her life. Before we get to what she built, you need to understand exactly what the winter of 1886 was shaping up to be, because the settlers in that meeting hall had no idea what was coming. The summer of 1886 on the northern plains had been one of the most brutal on record. Temperatures hit 108 degrees Fahrenheit in Miles City, Montana. Prairie fires scorched tens of thousands of acres. Streams stopped flowing. The ranges were dangerously overstocked. An estimated 5.7 million cattle had been pushed onto northern grasslands since 1866, and those grasses were burned down to bare earth. Old-timers noticed things they'd never seen before. White, snowy owls from Hudson Bay appearing on the Dakota plains, beavers stockpiling wood far beyond their usual stores, birds flying south weeks ahead of schedule. The land itself was signaling something catastrophic. The open-range cattlemen ignored every signal, and their herds stood in open pasture, fully exposed, with nothing between them and whatever the sky decided to do. Nora Halvorsen noticed the owls too, but she was already gone by the time any of them started paying attention. The morning after the vote, she walked northwest alone, carrying a spade, a wool blanket, a small sack with cornmeal and dried beans, and her $3.17. When she reached the clay gulch, a shallow creek bed roughly 6 feet deep, running east to west, choked on both banks with dense stands of broadleaf cattail, she didn't see a wasteland. She stood at the edge of it for a long time, looking at the plants. Every cattail stalk was topped with a dark brown seed head the size and shape of a corn dog, and inside each of those seed heads was not seeds in the conventional sense, it was fluff. Dense, packed, impossibly soft cattail down, ready to burst open at the slightest pressure. Each single seed head contains as many as 250,000 individual seed fibers, and every fiber is a hollow tube of dead air. She knew what that meant. She'd packed her boots with cattail fluff in Wisconsin as a girl. What she didn't know, what nobody in 1886 had the language to explain, was that she was looking at a natural insulation material that modern building scientists at Germany's Fraunhofer Institute have since measured at a thermal conductivity of 0.032 watts per meter Kelvin. That number puts loose cattail fluff in direct competition with fiberglass insulation, which didn't exist as a commercial product until 1938. 6 inches of tightly packed cattail fluff delivers somewhere between R14 and R22 of insulation value, and she was surrounded by enough of it to insulate a small city. But insulation was only half of what this gulch was about to give her. The first thing she did with her $3.17 was spend exactly $1.20 of it. A pound of nails was 3 to 5 cents in Dakota Territory in 1886. So she bought 5 pounds for about 20 cents, and she bought 50 pounds of flour for around $1, keeping the remaining dollar and change as an emergency reserve because she understood with painful clarity that emergencies were coming. Then she started digging. She chose the south-facing wall of the gulch, the steepest bank, where the earth rose nearly 6 feet above the creek bed floor, and dug into the hillside horizontally, not straight down. The spade cut into the clay-heavy prairie soil, which was stiff and resistant but held its shape cleanly, requiring no timber framing for the walls. Settlers who built dugouts on the northern plains typically excavated a rectangular room roughly 10 to 12 feet wide and 12 to 16 feet long, with the floor sitting 3 to 5 feet below the outside grade, and the surrounding earth did something that no wood frame, no canvas tent, and no poorly insulated sod house could do. Below a depth of about 4 to 6 feet in North Dakota, the earth maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round of approximately 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The North Dakota Geological Survey has confirmed this baseline. It is the residual heat from the Earth's interior, called geothermal buffering, and it does not fluctuate with the seasons the way surface soil does. The frost line in North Dakota can penetrate 75 inches deep during a brutal winter, but below that boundary the temperature holds, steady and unchanging. What this means for a dugout occupant in January is extraordinary. When surface air temperature drops to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, which it did at Fort Yates, Dakota Territory, before that winter was over, the surrounding walls of a properly built dugout are still holding at 45 to 55 degrees. Instead of heating a structure across an 8-degree differential, the way a surface cabin requires, the dugout occupant is heating across a differential of only 20 to 25 degrees, which is less than 1/3 the heating load. A single candle and 2 people's body heat can hold a well-built dugout above freezing, and a small fire can push it past comfortable. The Mandan and Hidatsa peoples, who had lived on the northern plains for centuries, built on exactly this principle. Their earth lodges 30 to 60 feet in diameter, with floors excavated below grade, thick earthen walls, and entrance tunnels that trapped cold air before it reached the living space, were designed specifically for Little Ice Age winters. They had understood geothermal buffering for 400 years before any European settler set foot in Dakota Territory, and the women of those tribes owned and built those lodges. Nora Halvorsen didn't know the Mandan word for it, but her hands knew the logic. Her roof was 3 layers. She cut cottonwood poles from the small stand growing along the creek bed, the only timber within a mile, which the committee had dismissed as useless scrub, and laid them side by side across the top of the excavation, spanning the full 12-foot width. Then she cut and piled dense bundles of dried prairie grass on top to create a thick mat that would prevent loose material from filtering through the poles. And then she cut sod blocks from the creek bank, each one roughly 3 feet long, a foot wide, 4 inches thick, and weighing close to 50 pounds, stacking them in 2 interlocking layers across the grass, the way brickwork overlaps at corners. The front wall, the only surface exposed to outside air, she built up from the outside grade using more sod blocks, leaving a door opening and 1 small south-facing window she framed with the cottonwood poles and covered with oilcloth she'd carried in her pack. The door itself was a split cottonwood plank she fitted into the frame and sealed along its edges with packed mud and prairie grass. 3 walls were raw earth, 1 wall was sod, the ceiling was earth sitting on poles and grass and sod, and the floor was packed clay tamped hard with the back of the spade until it held her weight without compressing. But it was what she did to the interior walls that made the difference, and it was the thing the committee would later call the strangest part of the whole structure. She went to the Cattail marsh and began harvesting. Over the course of 4 days, she cut cattail stalks, stripped the seed heads, and split them open. Each mature head released a cloud of soft white-brown fluff, the same material waterfowl used to line their nests, and she packed the fluff into every gap she could find, between the sod blocks on the front wall, between the pole roof joists and the grass layer, into the spaces between the wall's irregular clay surface and the rough cottonwood planking she nailed over it. Then she sewed bags from her calico and canvas rough pillowcase shapes, large and small, and stuffed them with cattail fluff until they were tight and firm. She hung these against the front wall, nailed them to the sloped ceiling where it met the earth bank, and laid several across the floor as a sleeping platform. Underneath her sleeping mat she piled a foot of dry cattail leaves, the long, flat, ribbon-like blades from the plant's base, which trapped air in their overlapping layers the same way feathers do. What she was building, without any terminology for it, was a dead-air insulation system layered over a geothermally buffered thermal mass. The earth walls provided the geothermal floor, never dropping below 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Cattail fluff bags provided the insulation layer on top of that, dramatically slowing the rate at which the cold air from outside could penetrate. Each microscopic hollow fibre in cattail down traps a pocket of still air, and still air is one of the worst conductors of heat in existence. Moving air strips warmth from any surface it touches that's wind chill, but trapped air cannot convect, so it sits motionless and refuses to move heat in any direction. A 6-inch layer of loose cattail fluff, as modern testing confirms, achieves thermal resistance equivalent to many times its own thickness in solid wood. And the fluff doesn't feel like insulation, it feels like a cloud, or goose down, or the inside of a baby bird's nest. And that sensory softness is exactly the physics working, with billions of dead air pockets, each one refusing to participate in heat transfer. She was burning almost no fuel to stay warm. A few dried cattail stalks, which burn hot and fast, were enough to bring the interior from 45 degrees Fahrenheit to comfortable warmth within 20 minutes, and the earth walls then absorbed that heat and held it for hours after the fire went out. By the second week of November 1886, she had a bedroll, a small supply of cornmeal and dried beans, and a dugout that could hold 58 degrees with no fire at all, on a night when the outside air sat at 12 above zero. The settlement, 2 miles away, heard about what she was doing. A committee member named Albrecht Bauer rode out to see it on a Sunday afternoon. He stood at the entrance, a low door set into a sod-faced hillside, so unimpressive it was nearly invisible, and laughed. He called it a badger hole. He said she was welcome to freeze in it. He rode back and told the settlement that the Halvorsen girl had built herself a pit in the ground and filled it with swamp fluff, and that they might need to dig her out in the spring if there was anything left to dig out. The settlement's winter preparations, by contrast, were standard: sod block construction, a few timber frame houses with thin pine board walls, cast iron stoves that burned through a cord of wood every 10 days. Several families had stacked their firewood supply against the south wall of their houses, a reasonable precaution against north winds, and they had perhaps 12 to 15 cords each, which they calculated would see them through February. They had no idea what February was about to look like. On the 16th of November 1886, the first major blizzard of that season hit the northern plains. 40-mile-per-hour winds, drifts 6 to 8 feet deep, and temperatures that plummeted to 13 degrees Fahrenheit at Fort Meade north of the Black Hills arrived together, and it was not the worst storm of the season, not by a considerable distance. The winter accelerated from there. By late December, Fort Yates, Dakota Territory, recorded 44 degrees Fahrenheit. By January 1887, snow was falling almost continuously across the northern zone, and on January 9, 16 inches of snow dropped in 16 hours, with gale-force winds and temperatures touching 46 degrees Fahrenheit in places. The worst arrived between January 28 and the 3rd of February 1887, when the temperature at Fort Assiniboine, Montana, dropped to an official Signal Corps reading of -55.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Bismarck recorded 43 degrees Fahrenheit on February 1 and again on February 12. Fargo set its all-time record low of 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Helena, Montana, swung across a 101.5-degree temperature range in a single month. The below-zero average held across Bismarck for the entire December through February period. This was the winter historians would later call the Big Die-Up. Open-range cattle, with nowhere to shelter and nothing to eat through the crusted-over grasslands, died by the hundreds of thousands. Theodore Roosevelt, ranching near Medora, Dakota Territory, lost somewhere between 60 and 65% of his roughly 3,200 head herd. Granville Stewart, president of the Montana Stock Growers Association, lost 60 to 72% of his 40,000 cattle. Montana alone recorded the loss of approximately 362,000 animals, roughly 60% of the territory's total herds, and Custer County's tax rolls dropped from 200 ranchers in 1,886 to 120 by 1888. The financial losses across the northern plains exceeded $20 million, which is over $600 million in today's money. The animals died in open pasture, fully exposed, where the wind never stopped moving. When the January blizzard arrived at Nora Halvorson's dugout, it found almost nothing to attack. The entrance faced south and slightly east, so the predominant north and northwest winds swept over the low roof and down into the creek bed rather than against the door. The sod front wall was 2 feet thick. The earth surrounding 3 sides and the ceiling had been sitting at 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit for months and would not be moved by a surface storm because the ground simply doesn't respond to surface air temperature on a timescale of hours or days. The Cattail insulation bags on the front wall and ceiling slowed the rate of heat loss through those surfaces to a trickle. She burned a small fire of cattail stalks once in the morning and once in the evening, and the interior temperature held between 52 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit when no fire was burning, reaching the mid-60s within half an hour of lighting one. On the night of the 1st of February 1887, when Bismarck recorded 43 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind drove snow horizontally across the open plain, Nora Halvorson was inside her dugout, warm, reading by the light of a tallow candle. 2 miles away, the settlement's situation was different. The thin-walled sod houses and board-frame structures that had seemed adequate in October were losing the thermal battle in February. Cast-iron stoves ran day and night. Firewood that was supposed to last through February was burning out by late January. The wind chill at 43 degrees Fahrenheit with 40 mph winds approaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit in effective temperature, and wood-framed walls with no insulation cannot hold against that. The cold pressed through every gap, every poorly fitted window frame, every uninsulated corner. 3 families in the settlement burned through their entire wood supply before the storm broke, and Albrecht Bauer, the man who had called Nora's dugout a badger hole 2 months earlier, found himself in a sod house where the interior temperature had dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit with a fire actively burning. He went to ask for help from the woman he'd helped exile, and she gave it. Nora Halvorson spent 2 days showing the families closest to her how to pack cattail fluff into their wall gaps, how to hang stuffed bags against the interior of their most exposed walls, how to bank earth up against their exterior sod walls on the windward side. She showed them how to cut cattail leaves and layer them on their floors as ground insulation. The materials cost nothing, the labor was a single afternoon, and the difference was immediate and measurable. Interior temperatures in the treated houses rose 10 to 15 degrees and held without additional fuel. Albrecht Bauer did not apologize, but the settlement's other families noticed who had the warm house and who didn't, and they noticed whose knowledge had saved 3 families from a genuinely dangerous situation. When March finally came and the Chinook winds began to move across the plains, what locals called Gentle Annie, arriving 1 month and thousands of cattle too late, Nora Halvorson walked out of her dugout into mud and snowmelt. Her cattle, a milk cow and 2 young steers she'd purchased in late October with a $2.50 credit arrangement at the general store, were alive. She'd kept them in a small earthen lean-to she'd dug into the same hillside, insulated with cattail leaves packed between rough-cut willow stakes, and the lean-to had held above freezing through the entire winter. The settlements committee met again in late March 1887, and this meeting had no written record, because frontier communities preferred to let certain things pass without documentation. But the land record at the Burleigh County Courthouse does tell part of the story. In April 1887, Nora Halvorson filed a formal homestead claim on 160 acres. The $4 filing fee was covered by her neighbors, collectively. She met the cultivation and residence requirements within 2 years, and proved up her claim in 1892. The $3 she'd started with were long gone by then, and she didn't need them anymore. Here is what you can take from this story into your own understanding of cold and shelter, because the physics works the same way it always has. Cattail fluff the soft brown down inside. Every mature cattail head has been tested by modern scientists and measured at a thermal conductivity that rivals commercial insulation. The hollow fibers trap billions of dead air pockets, and still air cannot convect, cannot carry heat away, and cannot participate in the thermal transfer that makes cold dangerous. A single acre of cattail marsh produces 4 to 6 dry tons of above-ground material per season, and every single one of those seed heads releases up to 250,000 individual hollow fibers. The material is free. It regenerates every year, and it grows in the places where cold and wetland overlap, which is exactly where northern plains winters are most lethal. Earth below 5 to 6 feet of depth holds at 45 to 55 degrees year-round, not because it is heated, but because it is insulated from the surface by its own mass, and because the Earth's internal temperature bleeds slowly upward from below. A structure built into that Earth doesn't need to fight the cold. It sits inside a thermal buffer the size of a continent. These were not accidents. The Mandan and Hidatsa peoples built into this principle deliberately, designing earth lodges that housed entire families and their horses through winters that routinely hit 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They covered their entrance tunnels to trap cold air at the threshold, excavated their floors below grade to sit within the geothermal baseline, and had been doing this on the very same land where Nora Halvorson's gulch sat for 4 centuries before a settlement committee voted 19-3. The knowledge was always here, and it required someone willing to pay attention to it. Nora Halvorson paid attention. She started with $3, a spade, and a cattail marsh that nobody wanted, and she built a shelter that held 58 degrees without a fire on the night Bismarck hit 43 degrees Fahrenheit, the same night that a winter killed 60% of the cattle on the northern plains couldn't touch her.